They opened the ledger on a sun-warmed table behind the house. The book lay heavy, its margins softened by use, its pages smelling of dust and ink. Amina sat with bare feet on the packed earth, breadcrumbs clinging to the skin of her toes, and watched the men who kept the house's accounts make a decision that would turn her private life into a public record. Master Henry spoke once, his voice measured and final. The scribe dipped his pen and, with a few deliberate strokes, marked a line that would travel across registers and out into generations. A woman reclassified, a name relabeled, an intimacy annexed to the ledger. What masters did in private, the archives show, was not merely another form of punishment. It was a systematic seizure of personhood, an administrative capture that turned relationships, bodies, and children into entries on a page. The ledger did more than record punishment. It redefined family and erased belonging. If you want more files like this opened, consider subscribing. Our work depends on it. The household was not merely a domestic unit. It functioned as a small jurisdiction, complete with steward, overseer, minister, scribe, and a ledger that served as both account book and moral register. Ledgers measured more than grain and cloth. They measured compliance, debts, favors, and crucially, social categories. The steward could allocate labor. The overseer enforced daily order. The minister supplied moral language that could be folded into contractual terms. The scribe translated all of this into ink. One ledger entry records Amina's name beside an annotation that later documents label as corrective assignment. An inspector's deposition, when later quoted, paraphrases that line as a formal decision to reclassify her status within the household. These are the kinds of phrases found across the fragments historians read: bureaucratic, blunt, and final. They read like accounting because they were meant to do the work of accounting, turning people into quantities and obligations. Amina's life before that line is not a reconstruction of myth, but the careful assembling of fragments. She was born into a family already bound to the household by debt. How many such births began under the shadow of ledger balances is a question the records return to, again and again. She learned to read in the margins, a neighbor letter folded into a book, the alphabet scratched into a piece of wood. Her small freedoms were precise and tactile. The river where she scrubbed clothes and watched minnows. The secret notebook where she practiced letters. The breath she took in the garden's shade when the house thought itself empty. Daniel appeared in these fragments as well. A field hand whose letters, when they survive, are rough but honest. A page held behind floorboards bore a short folded note that an archivist later labeled Hidden Correspondence, Amina, Shaker, Daniel. The note, smudged but legible in places, spoke of evenings by the river and the small economies of affection that people weave under constraint. Where lovers met quietly, household order read the meeting as a threat to discipline and profit. What was private affection became, through the ledger's translation, a liability. The inciting incident, what the records describe as the discovery, begins with something that looks ordinary in one household and devastating in another. A found note. A maid, a child, or a servant with access to an attic shelf handed the folded paper to the steward. The depositions that survive do not agree on every detail. Where they diverge, the script will mark those elements as indefinido. But the ledger entry that follows is unambiguous in its tone. The scribe writes a term that will be quoted in subsequent reports: corrective assignment. A minister's marginal note supplies the moral language, the need for order restored. The hand that once recorded births and rations now inscribed a new discipline. The tribunal that followed was less a judicial proceeding than a household ritual. Witnesses were summoned, household heads, the steward, sometimes a minister. Amina was made to stand in front of people who already held her life on a page. The record paraphrases, rather than quotes at length. Where reconstructive language appears, it is noted as such. A reconstructed line in a deposition reads, "You will be set to correct your errors before God and house." Such a phrase shows how spiritual language was retooled into a mechanism of assignment, a benediction doubling as a contract. The ritual included acts that were performative as much as administrative. The minister led what the ledger terms a ceremony, a public acknowledgement that was at once moral censure and formal declaration. A water ritual is noted in an inspector's report. A bath before the house, a cleansing framed in religious terms, followed by a pronouncement that folded the moral into the legal. Then the scribe made the ledger entry. Names were crossed out, lines redrawn with sober ink. The ceremony translated intimacy into obligation. From that moment, the mechanics of corrective assignment took hold in daily life. The archives show changes that at first glance look mundane and purely material. Rations reduced, different bed assignments, the removal of visitation privileges. But those changes mapped onto deeper restrictions. Censored letters, supervised movement, and bodily controls enforced in private quarters rather than public stocks. One register shows, in column form, an adjustment of clothing allotments the week after a corrective note appears. Another margin note reads, simply and chillingly, access to beds altered. Corrective intimacy is the phrase that recurs in inspector reports and marginalia, and it is worth pausing over what that phrase means in a documentary sense. The term refers to assigned cohabitations and coerced liaisons framed as moral rectification. Rather than purely punitive whipping or public shaming, corrective intimacy reorders sexual and domestic life under the authority of the household. A letter attributed to Amina, catalogued by an archivist as a letter and quoted carefully in a later petition, recounts a moment of coercion obliquely. As recorded, she wrote that she knelt before a Bible while a coin was held in the minister's hand and was told that her promise would be noted in the house's book. The phrasing is not explicit, it is meant to slow the eye, but the implication is clear. Spiritual ritual, economic token, and household record combine to bind choice to obligation. This kind of procedure was not a one-off. Multiple documents in the same family of records show similar architecture: discovery, ritual, inked reclassification, followed by regulated living. The ledger serves as the instrument that makes these changes durable. A child's name is entered with a parentage note that aligns the child not to a community, but to the ledger's valuation. Where a child might in other contexts be recorded as kin, here the child appears in column and tally, a calculation of support, labor potential, or obligation. The effect is genealogical erasure, lineage redirected through paperwork, resistance threaded through these pages like hidden stitching. When researchers, Investigator Lewis, Professor Andrews, and Amelia, an archivist who specializes in water-damaged registers, began to piece fragments, they found marginalia and artifacts that testify to refusal. A scrap of cloth holds a stitched name. Tiny, crowded letters form a signature sewn into a cuff, a deliberate claim of identity where ink could be scrubbed. A petition, folded and slipped into a ledger's binding, bears a stamp, refused. The petitioner's pleas survive as paper that a clerk refused to file, and the refusal itself became part of the archival trail. Hidden letters are the most intimate evidence of resistance. A small note found beneath a floorboard, catalogued by Amelia, reads in part, "We are not only what they count." It is brief, almost defiant in its redundancy. Other tiny acts are recorded. Food withheld on punishments, but neighbors slipping extra cornmeal at night. A child taught to read in secret by borrowing a catechism page. A pot scalded in the hearth the day a larder was locked. These are not grand rebellions so much as the everyday survival of subjectivity, ways that people insisted on themselves despite ledger lines that tried to pin them down. Reprisals were also recorded. Daniel is moved. A transfer order appears in a margin, the ink different from the rest, as if scribbled in haste. Where someone dared to petition the magistrate, a second document shows the petition stamped "refused" and the petitioner later punished for having brought a complaint. The ledger notes transfers, beatings recorded under the header of discipline in an overseer's daybook, and the household's habit of solving resistance by shedding people, sending them away so their claims would vanish with distance. The institutional erasure is one of the most painful parts of this archive. Pages were trimmed, names excised through careful cutting. Water damage obscured entire stretches of a register. A scribe's hand scraped out marginalia in one volume, leaving telltale scars on the paper. When the historians reconstruct these volumes, they do so like conservators of a palimpsest, reading the ghost of what remains and interpolating with careful notes about uncertainty. In a field note, Investigator Lewis writes that certain entries are partially effaced and marks the date as indefinido, where it cannot be established with confidence. That transparency about uncertainty is part of the historian's practice here, attesting to what the documents show and also to the gaps the documents leave. The climax of these processes is best understood as the moment when the household's ritual and the ledger's ink converge into a public, performative act that legally and socially reassigns a person. In a reconstructed account drawn from depositions and a minister's marginal note, the ceremony unspools in a single image. Amina standing with her hands folded, the minister invoking scripture as the steward sets a small coin in her palm. the scribe leaning to mark the ledger. The reconstructed wording of the steward, as recorded in a later deposition, suggests that the house was framing the arrangement as for the good of order and future maintenance, language that couches coercion in the language of provision. This is where the harm reveals itself as something distinct from corporal punishment. A lash or a brand wounds and scars the body. It is visible, and it is, in many historical contexts, acknowledged as punishment. What happened here was subtler, more insidious. It converted a woman's intimate life into an offered commodity written into the legal and moral documents of the household, thus shaping the terms of her future relationships and the status of any children born after the entry. The ledger's authority meant that the household could enforce obligations not just through immediate violence, but through long-reaching bureaucratic mechanisms, adjusting rations, reassigning children, rerouting genealogical claims. The ledger redefined who Amina could be to her own kin and to the world. One ledger entry shows the arrival of a child's name with a notation that aligns the infant's support to the household's accounts rather than to a family line. An inspector's note later paraphrases that practice in quieter terms. The child's status is entered as reliant upon the house. What such entries do, cumulatively, is to make lineage legible only within the ledger's frame, a family tree rewritten as columns and credits. The last surviving material trace that seems at once fragile and defiant is a small cuff, a cuff with a name stitched in a hand that does not match any of the recorded scribal hands. The cuff is catalogued in the archive as textile artifact, stitched inscription. Its thread is crude and dark against faded fabric. The letters are cramped but certain. For 200 years the name remained where ink might have been removed. The cuff is a living protest. Where pages were trimmed, cloth kept witness. Closing arguments are not the role of the historian-teller here, but the evidence gathered, when read with the care the records require, supports a specific claim. The household practice the ledger bears record of was an institutional seizure that reached deeper than episodic physical punishment. It reorganized personal ties and regulated reproductive and relational life. Where corporal punishment inflicts immediate pain, corrective assignment, as exercised in these pages, imposed a structural wound, an administrative remaking of who could be a mother, a wife, a kin. That administrative remaking often outlived the lash. It was written into the documents that govern social recognition and material support. There are unanswered questions. Certain entries are partially effaced. Some procedural terms appear only in marginalia and not in the central register. Specific legal language and dates are sometimes indefinido. Where the documents are thin, the reconstruction must be modest. The certainty in this story is not in every specific act, but in the consistent pattern across multiple sources. Discovery, ritual, ledger entry, followed by reconfigured daily life and restricted possibilities. When these sequences repeat in different registers, in different hands, a pattern becomes visible. Amina's later life, as the fragments disclose it, is not only a story of constraint, it is also a story of endurance. Hidden notations suggest that she taught a neighbor's child to read from memory. A cryptic line in a petition shows her name among the signatures of those who dared to ask for mercy. The stitched cuff survives as an everyday object that refused erasure. Her resistance was not dramatic so much as patient and ordinary. The saving of a letter, the teaching of a single alphabet, the sinking of a name into cloth. The ledger remained, however, as the house's enduring instrument. Generations later, the records produced genealogical confusion where the ledger had dictated terms. Descendants who tried to trace kin found pages cut or entries rewritten. Professor Andrews notes in a report that tracing certain family lines led to gaps coinciding with household registers that bear corrective annotations. Amelia, who resued and conserved the cuff, suggests that material traces of identity often survive in the least expected places: cloth, coin initials, marginal notes. When the stitch is held up now in a dim conservation room, it appears small and stubborn. The thread catches the light, and one can see the slight tremor where a needle passed too close to a knot. The cuff is not an answer, but a witness. It speaks to what the ledger tried to silence, that human beings leave traces that bureaucracies cannot entirely erase. We end where we began, with a ledger open on a worn table and Amina's stones of life scattered in the margins. The archives, with their trimmed pages, their water-stained volumes, and their stamped refusals, show that the harm done in private rooms under the cover of ritual and conscience was not mere excess cruelty. It was a structural operation that converted relationships into property and identities into accounted obligations. The ledger did, in effect, what no single whipping could. It made the intimate a permanent, regulated condition, often across generations. If this reconstruction shocks you, consider the small acts that keep these stories visible. Support local archival preservation, share this work, and leave reflections below about what surprised you or what you want researched next. The stitched cuff remains with the record, quiet, persistent, and refusing to be only a line in a book.